you so much to Professor Nancy Fraser for according us this interview, and it's an honor to have you here in Venice. A couple of days ago, you gave a speech at the conference Marx Indian Anthropocene, and your main argument was that eco-politics and environmental politics should be anti-capitalist and trans-environmental. And this is also the argument that you make in your book, Cannibal Capitalism, from Verso. So I wanted to ask you if you wanted to briefly sum up what you mean by this.
Happy to do that, and thanks for inviting me for the interview. I mean, the first thing to say is that we're in an extremely severe and acute moment of general crisis in which the ecological crisis is intertwined with and exacerbated by other aspects of this general crisis, including the political crisis, the crisis of democracy, the rise of authoritarian right-wing extremism, also the economic crisis, the precarity and insecurity of livelihoods of people across the world, including those who until a few decades ago thought they had a pretty secure and decent livelihood. So the worsening of economic conditions for the vast majority of people on the planet. Also, what some people call a crisis of care or social reproduction, which has to do with, let's say, the tremendous pressure on time, which makes it extremely difficult for people to simultaneously earn their living and keep their families and communities cared for and intact. So all of this is going on at the same time, and it's a rare kind of crisis where it's not sectoral, it's not just one sector, but all of these. That's rare in history, and in the past, on a few occasions when we faced crises like this, say in the 1930s, they were eventually resolved after a long time by a pretty big change in the nature of capitalism. And, but that required some kind of, let's say, cooperation between mobilized forces from below and elites who, instead of repressing those forces, found a way to use them. So we got in the United States the New Deal, or social democracy in Northern and Western Europe, and so on. All, of course, still draining wealth from the global South. Despite decolonization and political independence, supposedly. Anyway, we're in this kind of crisis now, and I argue in my book that the root of this crisis, as in every such previous crisis, is something fundamental at the heart of capitalism. And it is this relentless, unstoppable drive to accumulate capital, not only through the exploitation of paid workers in factories, which is the picture I think that most people have about, you know, what capitalism is, how it accumulates. That's all true. But in addition to that, capital accumulation relies on what I call cannibalization, that is just simply taking wealth from families, from communities, from nature, from subjugated and racialized, unfree or semi-free populations, taking all that wealth and not replenishing it, so that factory workers at least are supposed to get paid, right, for their living costs, their socially necessary labor time. But in these other cases, you don't even get that. It basically wealth that is looted or stolen and not compensated, and certainly not replenished or repaired. That, I think, is the root of the crisis, and I don't think it can ever be fully resolved without disabling that accumulation dynamic that is fundamental to capitalism. Now, so that's the first part of your question. Eco-politics has to be anti-capitalist because we're at such a stage at this moment that it's not clear from an ecological perspective that there is actually time or even the possibility of a new kind of capitalism able to resolve the planetary crisis. I have my doubts. We can't maybe prove it absolutely, but I think we're much better off going with anti-capitalism at this point. However, because the ecological crisis is so tightly linked up to and entwined with these other dimensions of crises, all, in a sense, flowing from the same dynamic of cannibalization. Cannibalization of nature, cannibalization of care, cannibalization of public powers and capacities, and of racialized peoples and so on, and of working people more generally. You can't have a standalone environmental movement. That is not going to cut it, because you know, for many people get convinced by the dominant ideology of the system that if you try to protect nature, you're taking their jobs and livelihoods away from them, right? You're opposing development, and their sort of economic and social survival depends on development and jobs. This is an ideology and it's false, but it's believed, and I think one has to create what I'm calling a trans-environmental historical block of social forces that would connect people whose central and immediate concerns are ecological because they're living in floodplains or wildfire areas or rising sea areas that are going to destroy their homes and so on, to be able to unite people for whom ecology is the most pressing concern with others whose pressing concerns have to do with livelihood or family and the ability to care for children and aging parents and so on, for people who are fleeing violence through attempting to migrate to safer places, people who are for whom governments that they thought they could rely on to provide the public goods that they need in their communities to live well are not providing those things, either cannot or will not. So in other words, I'm trying to suggest that to really transform the system requires a big scaling up of not just resistance, but transformative political alliances that would unite trade unions and non-unionized workers with advocates for families, for women, feminist movements, ecological movements of peasants, as well as of those who are focused on global warming in the planetary sense, defenders of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I'm calling trans-environmental, not single-issue environmentalism, but struggles, forms of ecological contestation that appreciate the intertwined nature of the problem, of the crisis, and which want to make common cause with people whose priorities and situations might differ slightly or maybe even dramatically, but who all have the same enemy, who are all in the terrible position they're in because of this cannibal capitalism.